Don't scroll. Stay here for a moment because tonight's story begins with a single night that quietly changed the direction of two lives forever. If you have ever wondered how someone can spend months pretending they are completely fine while secretly carrying words they never had the courage to speak, then listen carefully. This is not a prediction, and it is not a promise about your own future. It is a fictional story about two people whose hearts remained connected through memories they believed had faded away. Last night, after the city had fallen silent and the final lights disappeared behind closed curtains, one of them found themselves unable to sleep. They turned off the television, placed their phone on the table, and tried to convince themselves that tomorrow would be different, but every attempt to distract their mind failed. The silence became louder than every excuse they had repeated to themselves over the past year. They walked slowly toward the window and stared into the darkness outside, wondering why a perfectly ordinary night suddenly felt so heavy. The answer arrived not through a miracle but through memory. One forgotten conversation returned with surprising clarity. Then another. And another. They remembered the first time they laughed together, the small moments that seemed insignificant at the time, the conversations that ended too soon, and the feelings that neither of them knew how to explain. Every memory carried a question they had never answered. Had they walked away because it was truly over, or because fear had spoken louder than honesty? That question refused to leave them alone. They sat down, closed their eyes, and admitted something they had spent far too long denying. They had never really stopped caring. They had simply become experts at pretending otherwise. As the hours passed, they searched through an old notebook they had not opened in months. Between faded pages they discovered unfinished sentences, half-written letters, and thoughts that had never been shared with anyone. Each line reminded them that some emotions do not disappear just because time moves forward. They become quieter, waiting patiently until life slows down enough for us to hear them again. They began writing without worrying whether anyone would ever read the words. They wrote about missed opportunities, about conversations interrupted by pride, about the strange way distance can make ordinary memories feel extraordinary. They realized they had spent so much energy protecting themselves from disappointment that they had also protected themselves from honesty. That realization hurt more than they expected because the truth was simple. They had not been waiting for the perfect moment. They had been waiting for the courage they never allowed themselves to find. The night continued, and with every passing hour they felt another invisible weight disappear from their heart. Nothing outside the room changed. No dramatic event interrupted the silence. Yet everything inside them was changing. They finally understood that healing does not begin when every problem disappears. It begins the moment someone chooses honesty instead of avoidance. They wondered whether the other person had experienced nights like this too. Perhaps somewhere far away another window was glowing with the same sleepless thoughts. Perhaps another notebook held unfinished sentences written for someone who might never read them. They would never know for certain, but for the first time they accepted that certainty is not always necessary. Sometimes growth begins with a single decision, to stop running from the truth. As dawn slowly approached, the darkness outside gave way to the first pale light of morning. They took a deep breath and whispered words they had never been brave enough to say aloud before. I cannot change yesterday, but I can choose who I become today. Those words did not erase regret, but they transformed it into determination. They closed the notebook, stood beside the window once more, and watched the sunrise with a quiet sense of hope. Whatever happened next, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Last night was not the ending of their story. It was the first chapter they had finally been honest enough to write. The morning arrived quietly, yet it did not feel like any other morning they had lived through before. The sunlight touched the window exactly as it always had, the sounds outside followed their familiar rhythm, and people hurried through another ordinary day without realizing that somewhere, behind a single closed door, a heart had finally stopped hiding from itself. They made coffee, but the taste was different because their thoughts were no longer racing in every direction. Instead, one simple question stayed with them wherever they went. If life offered one more honest conversation, would they finally have the courage to speak without fear? That question remained unanswered as they moved through the day, smiling politely at strangers, completing ordinary tasks, and pretending everything was exactly the same as yesterday. Yet inside, everything had changed. Every familiar place reminded them that time continues moving whether people are ready or not. They realized how often they had postponed important words while believing there would always be another chance. They remembered moments when silence seemed easier than vulnerability, moments when pride disguised itself as strength, and moments when fear quietly convinced them that protecting their heart mattered more than expressing it honestly. Looking back now, they understood that fear had never truly protected them. It had only delayed the truth. As the afternoon passed, they opened an old box filled with forgotten photographs, handwritten notes, ticket stubs, and tiny keepsakes that most people would consider meaningless. Each object carried a memory that had survived long after the moment itself disappeared. They smiled at some memories and quietly apologized to others. They realized that even painful chapters had shaped the person they had become. Without those mistakes, they might never have learned the value of honesty, patience, and forgiveness. They no longer wanted to rewrite the past. They wanted to understand it. That realization brought an unexpected calm they had not experienced in a very long time. Later that evening they decided to take a walk through familiar streets. Nothing extraordinary happened. Cars passed by. Children laughed in the distance. Friends greeted each other without knowing the silent transformation taking place inside someone walking among them. Yet every step felt meaningful because for the first time they were not running away from memories. They were walking beside them without resentment. They understood that healing is not forgetting. Healing is remembering without allowing the memory to control who you become. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, they stopped near a quiet park bench where they had once shared one of the happiest conversations of their life. The bench looked ordinary, but memories gave it extraordinary meaning. They sat there for several minutes without speaking, simply allowing themselves to appreciate how much they had changed since that day. They were no longer searching for perfect endings. They were searching for genuine beginnings built on honesty instead of assumptions. In that peaceful silence they reached for their notebook once again. This time they did not write about regret. They wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for every lesson that had taught them resilience. Gratitude for every misunderstanding that eventually revealed the importance of communication. Gratitude for every goodbye that forced them to discover strengths they never knew they possessed. As page after page filled with thoughtful reflections, they noticed something remarkable. The heaviness that had followed them for so long no longer felt impossible to carry. It had become lighter because they had finally stopped fighting it. They accepted that every meaningful relationship leaves behind something valuable, whether it lasts forever or becomes a chapter remembered with quiet respect. That understanding transformed sadness into wisdom. Night arrived once again, but this night felt completely different from the one before. Instead of fearing the silence, they welcomed it. Instead of avoiding their thoughts, they listened carefully to what those thoughts were trying to teach them. They realized that life rarely changes through dramatic moments alone. More often it changes through small decisions repeated consistently. Choosing honesty over avoidance. Choosing kindness over bitterness. Choosing hope over fear. Those quiet choices eventually become the foundation of an entirely different future. They looked toward the stars, smiled softly, and whispered a promise to themselves. Whatever tomorrow brings, they would never again allow fear to speak louder than truth. They would value meaningful conversations while they still had the opportunity to have them. They would appreciate the people who made ordinary days unforgettable instead of assuming there would always be more time. Most importantly, they would continue becoming someone they could genuinely respect, regardless of where life eventually led them. As they closed the notebook and prepared to leave the park, they realized that the most important message from last night had never been about changing someone else. It had always been about changing themselves. And sometimes, that single realization becomes the beginning of a story far more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. Days passed, but the quiet transformation that had begun that unforgettable night continued growing in ways they never expected. Every morning became an opportunity to choose differently. Instead of rushing through each day with their thoughts buried beneath endless distractions, they started paying attention to the little moments they had ignored for so long. The warmth of the sunrise, the sound of rain against the window, the familiar streets that had witnessed so many chapters of their life, and the unexpected kindness of strangers all seemed to carry a new meaning. It was as though life had not changed at all, yet their way of seeing it had become completely different. They realized that for years they had been searching for dramatic answers while overlooking the quiet truths that had always surrounded them. One evening, while organizing old shelves that had remained untouched for months, they found another notebook hidden beneath a stack of forgotten books. Unlike the previous one, this notebook contained dreams rather than memories. Every page described plans they once believed would surely come true. There were places they wanted to visit, conversations they hoped to have, goals they promised themselves they would one day achieve, and small reminders written in hopeful handwriting that simply said, "Keep believing in who you are becoming." Reading those pages felt like meeting a younger version of themselves. Someone who still believed that courage would always arrive before opportunity. Someone who had not yet learned how easily fear can disguise itself as wisdom. They smiled gently, closed the notebook for a moment, and whispered a quiet apology to the person they used to be. Not because life had gone wrong, but because they had spent too long doubting the strength that had always lived inside them. That realization inspired them to begin writing again, but this time every sentence focused on tomorrow instead of yesterday. They no longer wanted to measure life by the opportunities they had missed. They wanted to measure it by the choices they still had the power to make. Each new page became a promise that they would speak honestly when honesty was needed, forgive when forgiveness brought peace, and remain patient when answers refused to arrive immediately. They understood that real growth rarely announces itself with loud celebrations. Most of the time it begins quietly, in ordinary moments when nobody else is watching. As the weeks continued, they noticed another unexpected change. The memories that once brought sadness now brought perspective. Instead of asking why certain chapters had ended, they began asking what those chapters had taught them. Every difficult experience had strengthened qualities they once overlooked within themselves. Patience had replaced frustration. Understanding had replaced assumptions. Compassion had replaced resentment. They realized that pain often becomes meaningful only after enough time has passed for wisdom to grow around it. One afternoon they received an unexpected message from an old friend. The conversation was simple, filled with everyday updates and familiar laughter, yet it reminded them how valuable genuine human connection can be. After the conversation ended, they sat quietly for several minutes reflecting on how many relationships become distant not because people stop caring, but because everyone becomes busy believing there will always be another chance to reconnect. That thought encouraged them to reach out to others they had unintentionally drifted away from. Not every conversation reopened old friendships, but each sincere effort brought peace because they were finally acting from honesty rather than hesitation. Slowly they discovered that courage is not measured by dramatic moments. Sometimes courage is simply sending a message, making a phone call, admitting a mistake, or expressing gratitude before it is too late. One evening they returned to the same window where everything had begun on that sleepless night. The view outside looked exactly the same, yet they no longer felt trapped by silence. Instead, silence had become a trusted companion, a place where they could think clearly without fear. Looking out into the distance, they understood that the greatest turning point of their journey had never been a single event. It had been the decision to stop hiding from themselves. Everything that followed had grown naturally from that one honest choice. They smiled, closed the curtains, and prepared for another peaceful night, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new lessons, but also knowing something even more important. Whatever happened next, they would face it as someone who had finally learned that hope becomes strongest when it is supported by honesty, kindness, patience, and the quiet determination to keep moving forward one sincere step at a time. And although the road ahead remained uncertain, uncertainty no longer frightened them. It reminded them that every meaningful story still has unwritten pages waiting to be filled, not by perfect circumstances, but by ordinary people who choose courage over comfort, truth over fear, and growth over regret. With that understanding resting peacefully in their heart, they turned off the light, closed their eyes, and welcomed the future, not because they knew exactly what it would bring, but because they had finally become the kind of person ready to meet it with confidence, humility, and an open heart. The following weeks unfolded with a quiet rhythm that no longer felt empty. Every sunrise reminded them that healing is rarely dramatic. It arrives through ordinary mornings, honest choices, and small moments that slowly reshape an entire life. They stopped searching for instant answers and instead became curious about the person they were becoming. Every challenge now carried a lesson instead of a burden. Every disappointment became an invitation to grow instead of another reason to give up. They discovered that peace is not something waiting at the end of a perfect journey. Peace is something built one decision at a time. One afternoon they found themselves walking through familiar streets again, but this time nothing felt heavy. The same places that once reminded them of regret now reminded them of resilience. They smiled as they passed the small cafe where they had once imagined countless conversations. They remembered how much time they had wasted wondering about things they could never control. Now their attention rested on the present. The people around them laughed, hurried toward work, greeted old friends, and continued living ordinary lives, unaware that someone among them had quietly transformed from the inside out. That realization filled them with gratitude because they finally understood that the greatest victories often happen silently. Nobody applauds the moment someone forgives themselves. Nobody notices the exact second fear loses its grip. Nobody celebrates the instant a heart decides to become hopeful again. Yet those invisible victories are often the ones that change an entire future. Later that evening they returned home, opened the notebook once more, and began writing a new chapter instead of rereading the old ones. The words came naturally now. There was no hesitation, no struggle to explain emotions that once felt impossible to describe. They wrote about courage, not as something extraordinary, but as the quiet willingness to tell the truth even when it feels uncomfortable. They wrote about patience, not as waiting without purpose, but as trusting that meaningful things deserve time. They wrote about kindness, not because everyone always deserves it, but because becoming a kinder person had changed them more than holding on to resentment ever could. As page after page filled with thoughtful reflections, they noticed that their handwriting looked calmer than before, almost as if their heart itself had learned to breathe more slowly. They paused for a moment and looked toward the window. The night sky stretched endlessly above the city, reminding them that life continues moving whether people are ready or not. Instead of fearing that truth, they welcomed it. Movement meant possibility. Tomorrow still contained conversations that had not yet happened, opportunities that had not yet appeared, friendships waiting to grow stronger, and dreams waiting patiently for someone brave enough to pursue them. They realized how often they had believed the best parts of life belonged to the past, when in reality the future had quietly been preparing lessons even more valuable than the memories they refused to release. That understanding inspired them to create a simple promise. From that day forward they would stop measuring life by what they had lost and start measuring it by what they still had the ability to build. They would celebrate progress instead of perfection. They would choose honesty instead of assumptions. They would protect their peace without closing their heart. Most importantly, they would never again postpone meaningful words simply because fear suggested there would always be another opportunity. The following morning they woke earlier than usual. For the first time in a long while they felt genuinely excited about an ordinary day. Nothing extraordinary had been planned, yet everything seemed filled with quiet possibility. They prepared breakfast, opened the curtains, and watched the first sunlight slowly brighten the room. In that peaceful silence they smiled without forcing it. It was the kind of smile that comes only after someone has accepted both the beauty and the difficulty of their own journey. They understood that every chapter, even the painful ones, had shaped their strength. Every goodbye had taught appreciation. Every setback had revealed resilience. Every unanswered question had encouraged deeper self-understanding. Life had never been trying to defeat them. It had been teaching them, one experience at a time, how to become someone capable of facing uncertainty with grace instead of fear. As the day unfolded, they noticed opportunities to encourage others in simple ways. A genuine compliment. A patient conversation. A sincere thank you. Small gestures that required very little yet carried remarkable meaning. They discovered that kindness has a quiet ripple effect. One thoughtful action often inspires another, creating moments of hope that travel much farther than anyone realizes. By evening they returned home feeling peacefully tired rather than emotionally exhausted. Before sleeping they opened the notebook one final time and wrote a single sentence beneath everything else: "The story I was waiting for did not begin when someone else changed. It began when I finally chose to change." They closed the notebook gently, placed it beside the bed, and turned off the light. The room became silent once again, but this silence no longer carried loneliness. It carried confidence. It carried acceptance. It carried the comforting knowledge that although tomorrow remained unwritten, they no longer feared the blank page. They welcomed it with an open heart, ready to continue writing a life shaped not by regret, but by honesty, resilience, compassion, and the quiet courage to keep moving forward no matter what the next sunrise might bring. As another sunrise slowly painted the sky with gentle shades of gold, they stood by the same window where everything had quietly begun and realized how different the silence felt now. The room had not changed. The view outside had not changed. Even the familiar sounds of another ordinary morning remained exactly the same. The only thing that had truly changed was the person standing there. They no longer searched for certainty before taking a step forward. They no longer believed every answer had to arrive immediately. Instead, they had learned to trust the slow rhythm of growth, understanding that the strongest transformations rarely happen all at once. They happen through countless small choices made when nobody is watching. As they prepared to begin another day, they noticed something they had overlooked for a long time. Their reflection no longer carried the weight of someone waiting for permission to move on. It reflected someone who had accepted every chapter, every mistake, every lesson, and every memory as part of a journey that could never have unfolded any other way. That realization filled them with quiet gratitude. They thought about the sleepless night that had started everything, the notebook filled with honest words, the walks through familiar streets, the memories that had once brought sadness but now carried wisdom, and the promise they had made to themselves never to let fear speak louder than truth again. None of those moments had been extraordinary on their own. Yet together they had created a completely different future. Throughout the following weeks, life continued presenting unexpected opportunities. Some doors opened. Others remained closed. Some people stayed. Others quietly drifted in different directions. For the first time, they accepted every outcome without believing it defined their worth. They understood that not every relationship is meant to last forever, but every meaningful connection leaves behind something valuable. Some leave beautiful memories. Some leave difficult lessons. Others leave the courage to become someone stronger than before. All of them shape who we become if we allow them to teach instead of merely hurt us. One quiet evening they returned to the park bench where they had once sat, overwhelmed by unanswered questions. The trees moved gently in the evening breeze, children laughed in the distance, and the sky slowly changed from blue to orange before fading into soft twilight. They smiled as they realized how much had changed since the last time they sat there. Back then they had been searching for answers outside themselves. Now they carried those answers within. They no longer asked whether the past should have unfolded differently. They simply appreciated that every experience had guided them toward greater honesty, deeper compassion, and a more peaceful understanding of life itself. Sitting there, they opened their notebook one final time. Most of its pages were now filled with reflections, dreams, apologies, gratitude, and quiet promises. Only one blank page remained. They looked at it for several minutes before writing slowly and carefully. Every ending I feared became the beginning I never expected. Every moment I tried to escape became a lesson I now treasure. Every unanswered question helped me discover who I truly am. My future no longer depends on changing yesterday. It depends on the choices I make today. They closed the notebook gently, knowing there was nothing more that needed to be written. Some stories reach their ending not because every mystery has been solved, but because the people living those stories have finally found peace within themselves. As they stood to leave, they took one last look around the park, grateful for every step that had brought them there. Walking home beneath the evening sky, they realized the greatest gift they had received was not another chance to relive the past. It was the freedom to create a better tomorrow. They understood that hope is strongest when it is built on honesty, resilience grows through patience. And love, whether shared with others or quietly held within ourselves, is most meaningful when it inspires us to become kinder, wiser, and more courageous. When they finally reached home, they placed the notebook carefully on the shelf instead of hiding it away. It no longer represented unfinished chapters. It represented proof that people can grow beyond fear without forgetting where they came from. Before turning off the lights, they looked once more toward the window where this journey had begun. The night outside was peaceful, not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because they had stopped expecting perfection before allowing themselves to feel grateful. They smiled, whispered a quiet thank you for every lesson, every challenge, every unexpected turn, and every ordinary day that had quietly shaped an extraordinary transformation. Then they closed the curtains, took one deep breath, and stepped confidently into the next chapter of their life, carrying with them the quiet certainty that the most meaningful stories are not remembered because everything went exactly as planned. They are remembered because ordinary people found the courage to face uncertainty with honesty, to meet disappointment with compassion, to answer fear with hope, and to continue moving forward even when the road ahead remained unwritten. And with that peaceful understanding resting gently in their heart, the story that began on one unforgettable night came to its natural conclusion, not with perfect answers, but with lasting wisdom, quiet strength, and the comforting reminder that every new sunrise offers another opportunity to live with courage, kindness, gratitude, and an open heart.